Hello and welcome to today's vlog. Isn't it strange what you might come across when you're sorting through your files and your documents as you sort things out preparing for moving home. And a few days ago I came across an item which I had no idea I had, and it comes from more than 20 years ago. When I was the minister in Sheffield, we had in our circuit a young man who came as a lay worker in the circuit. His name is Nick Moxon. Nick is now a Methodist minister. So him and his wife Catherine were living in the circuit where Sue and I were, and Nick was training to be a local preacher, lay preacher at that time. And I just happened to come across a copy of a project that he did, because in those days, I don't know if it's still the same, when you'd completed all the different elements of the training course for a local preacher, that you then had to do a final assignment, which was a research project, or produce a paper on a subject of your choice, a relevant subject of your choice. And I came across the project that Nick produced. I have no idea why I've still got that. There it is. It's a project that was titled by Nick, Deafness in the Church. And it's not to do with members of the church being deaf, but it's to do with the church's response to deaf people who may come and be part of the church and engaged in worship. And how should the church be responding to deaf people who may be part of the congregation? Now, I did send an image of the cover to Nick a few days ago, and he very humbly said the best thing for that is to be put in the recycle bin. But anyway, it's well worth reading, and it's an important issue, isn't it? Not only how does the church respond and cater for and help deaf people, but people of any person. How do we most effectively communicate the gospel? At one of my churches, we've got a blind lady in there, and how do we best support her, or people who have different disabilities, or indeed how do we as a church communicate the gospel in a language that people can understand? So often we use churchy language, thinking that because we've used those words like holiness or redemption, salvation, all sorts of things, we kind of think that everybody knows what they mean, of course that's not the case. So how do we communicate the gospel in a way that is effective and enables people to hear in a way that they understand and can receive? I remember a fellow minister some time ago saying that when he first came into a church building, having had no church connection before, he sat in this meeting and somebody, I think one of the stewards, said the minister's contact details can be found hanging up on the notice board in the vestibule. And this chap said, I have no idea what a vestibule is. So we've got to be very careful how we use language to communicate the gospel. And I want to come back to the subject of deafness in the church in a different context. But first of all, thinking of Nick and how we communicate the gospel has also reminded me of a story relating to Nick's wife, Catherine. Catherine is a sign language interpreter. So she would interpret events, conferences or what have you for people who are deaf. And interestingly, Sue and I were sat watching an old teaching tape from a Spring Harvest conference from a few years ago, and there's this guy up the front as the main speaker in the big top in probably Skegness perhaps, or Minehead, where Spring Harvest is held. So all these people listening, and we noticed that not far from where the speaker stood was this lady, and we immediately recognised it was Catherine doing the sign language interpretation for that event. So that was nice to see Catherine again. But what I wanted to say was that Catherine worked at the university in Sheffield when we were there, and she encouraged Sue, who didn't have a paid job at that time, to apply to become a note taker at Sheffield Hallam University, which meant that you go into lectures and you take notes for someone who is deaf, who may be able to lip read or in some way obviously look at the screen, but can't do that and take notes at the same time. So you sit with the deaf person and you take notes. And Sue was a bit unsure, and I must confess at this point that when she asked me what I thought, I said, well, the two problems I can foresee. First of all, your writing's not very good, and secondly, you can't spell. So I put a bit of a damper on it, but Catherine was really encouraging of Sue to apply for this role. So Sue eventually did so, and took an exam of some description and passed with flying colours. And so for, I think, maybe 17 years while we're in, probably a little bit less, but certainly many years while we're in Sheffield. And then for the 12 years we're in Doncaster, Sue continued to work at Sheffield Hallam University, not only as a note taker, but as a mentor, as a support to people, students with various disabilities. And the point I want to get out of that is that Catherine, our friend Catherine, saw gifting in Sue that even I, as Sue's husband, didn't see. And Catherine's encouragement to Sue to pursue this possibility was something that proved to be a real blessing. Sue loved doing that work and only stopped doing it when we moved to Leicester because the universities here had a different system. So it wasn't really easy to fit into that system. So Sue is, and I am so grateful to Catherine for suggesting that to Sue. And it's a reminder that sometimes we can't see gifts and abilities in ourselves or in other people, but we need to be open to recognise, as Catherine did, and to encourage people in using their gifts. And God often chooses people who we wouldn't choose. Why? I don't even know why he chose me in many ways, but God saw in me something that I couldn't see in myself, and probably many other people couldn't see. So whoever you are, you might think you haven't got much to offer, not many gifts, but God sees great, enormous potential in you. So let's just rejoice in that God gifts each of us in different ways, and just follow promptings that we may be given to exercise those gifts in different opportunities. So that's another important point arising out of me discovering this project of Nick's. And the final one is this: deafness in the church was the subject, and it was to do with how the church supports deaf people. But I wonder also if we can think about deafness in the church, whether we as church are actually listening to what God is saying. I believe that in this time of coronavirus, in time of upheaval, a time of change, a time of some difficulties, God is clearly speaking into our lives, calling us to a new way of doing things. Are we as church ready to listen to God's voice, to the Holy Spirit's promptings, to see new opportunities, to grasp those new opportunities, not just to yearn to go back to the former ways? In fact, there's a verse in the scriptures that says, forget the former ways, do not dwell on the past. See, the Lord is doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? Do we perceive what God is doing? Are we listening to his voice? As I leave Leicester and my three churches here, I want to encourage them to, as they look to the future, to be listening to what God is saying, to pursue God's way, for God's way is always the best way. So there's three things. How do we as church communicate the gospel in a way that is meaningful and relevant to people, whoever they may be? Secondly, do we recognize the gifts in others, and can we rejoice that God sees gifts and abilities in us that we maybe cannot see, and wants to use us in his service And thirdly, are we as church deaf to what God is saying? Are we listening? Are we attentive to the voice of God? So, Nick, thank you for bringing those thoughts to mind. And I'm going to go into retirement. I'm going to really read your project and meditate on it. So God bless you. Thank you so much for listening today.